Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in today. I'm David Robinson, and I'm really glad that you're spending part of your time tuning into CCC's online service. You know, Edward Hallowell was a senior lecturer at Harvard Medical School, and he writes that for most people, the two most powerful experiences in life are achieving and connecting. He says most of what grabs our attention or commands our energy, it falls into these two categories: connecting and achieving. Connecting has to do with our relational world. Things like falling in love or forming a deep friendship or hearing words of affection and affirmation from a parent or a child. That's connecting. And achieving has to do with the world of our accomplishments, winning a contest or pursuing a successful career or realizing a difficult goal. Hallowell, he goes on to point out that our society is increasingly devoted to and obsessed with and enslaved by achieving, and that compared to other societies and other eras in history, we are increasingly bankrupt and impoverished when it comes to connecting to relationships. There's a lack of community. Now, achieving is not a bad thing. When it's done in the right way for the right reasons, it's a good thing, but it's no substitute for relationships. I've never known anybody who succeeded at relationships, who cultivated great friends, who mastered the art of giving and receiving love, that had a bad life. No matter how much or little money they made, no matter what rung they occupied on anybody else's ladder of success, people who give themselves to relational greatness, people who have deep friends that they laugh with and cry with, that they learn together with, that they fight with and forgive with. Those are people who lead magnificent lives, whether or not they're ever noted by our society. And when they die, not one of them dies with regrets of having devoted themselves to people, to their friends, to their family. Not one of them. Being in meaningful relationships, in community, it's life-giving to human beings. It's life-giving to you even in the most literal sense. One of the most famous research projects that's ever been done on relationships, it's called the Alameda County Study. And it was headed by a Harvard social scientist, and it took place over a 9-year period of time. And they tracked the lives of 7,000 people, residents of this particular county, Alameda County. And they found that the most isolated people were 3 times more likely to die than the most relationally connected people. Very interesting findings. They discovered that people who had bad health habits, things like smoking or poor eating patterns or obesity or alcohol use and the like, people that had poor health habits but strong relational connections, they lived significantly longer than people who had great health habits but were isolated. In other words, they found that it's better to eat Twinkies with good friends than to eat broccoli alone. It's better to have a pan meat lover's pizza with your friends than a kale smoothie by yourself. It's scientifically established. Robert Putnam, he did a lot of research on this, and he says that just at a physical level, just your body, if you make no other changes this year other than one, all right, if you're not in a small group right now and you join a small group, he says you cut your odds of dying in the next year in half. In half. Which is why the new motto for small groups around here at CCC is, join a group or die. Seriously though, I believe studies like this, the science is simply confirming at a biological level what the Bible clearly teaches, that you were created for community. You were made for relational connectedness. You were designed by God to love and be loved, to know and be known, to serve and be served, to celebrate and be celebrated. And to miss out on this is to miss out on the reason why God made you. Whatever else you achieve, whatever else you accomplish, however much other stuff you pile up, however high you climb on the ladder, you miss this and you miss the reason why you were made. Without deep relational connectedness, you can't have fullness of life. And just as important, without deep relational connectedness, you can't know and serve God. That's why in the Bible, for example, the disciple John, he writes in 1 John 4, he says, anyone who claims to love God, whom they haven't seen, but fails to love people whom they have seen, is a liar. The two are connected. We're in a series called What on Earth Are We Here For? And CCC is fast approaching the 15-year mark. In fact, in just a couple of weeks, on the first weekend of March, we will celebrate 15 years since launching Community Christian Church in 2006. And from the beginning, we've been about helping people find their way back to God. And we're asking in this series, well, what does that look like? What will characterize someone who has committed themselves to walking with God? And we're exploring a different characteristic each week and doing a little self-reflection, asking, is this true of me? Can this be said of me? And we talked about how Jesus is Lord over everything, and we got to make him Lord over our lives as well. And we talked last week about having an ever-increasing trust in God. And this week, we're talking about Christ-centered relationships. Most certainly on the list are Christ-centered relationships. It's one of the ways we find our way back to God, and it's one of the ways that we grow into what God calls us to be. We don't typically grow in isolation. In fact, the Bible speaks directly to this in Ephesians 4, when the Apostle Paul, he writes to the church at Ephesus, and he says, speaking the truth in love to each other, we will grow to become in every respect, and notice this, not mature individuals, but we will become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. That is, growth requires community. When I'm by myself, I can deceive myself. I can read, love one another and think, well, I agree with that. I'm pro-love. I'm all for love. And then I give myself credit for maturity on the love scale. And then I run into an actual person and I don't always do so well. See, in isolation, I'll give myself credit for growth based on my hypothetical agreement with the Bible, and I can get all moved about how much I love God and all that. But it takes real people for me to see just how much sin there is in my life, just what a knucklehead I can be from time to time. It's in community that we see the truth about ourselves. It's in community that we help each other recognize our blind spots. It's in community that we get loved and encouraged and taught and admonished with one another and cheered to keep going on. We grow in community. See, there's this great misconception. A lot of people hold to this. They say, hey, I can just grow, just me and God all by myself. But you can't. It's really a strong idea folks carry around, but it's a misconception. And what we're talking about here are Christ-centered relationships. Jesus made this staggering promise in the Bible. Check this out from the 18th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. He said, wherever 2 or 3 of you are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of you. In other words, Christians, followers of Jesus, disciples of Jesus, do not get formed in isolation. In other words, Jesus, who is always present, omnipresent is the theological word for it, but he is uniquely present in community, in a collection of people, wherever 2 or 3 of you are gathered. There's a way to think about this, a picture of this. I don't know if you've ever been camping before, but when I was growing up, our family, my parents and my 2 older brothers and myself, we would vacation in a little pop-up camper. The sides of that pop-up camper folded out to form 2 little fold-out beds on each side with a little space in the middle of it there. And then we'd attach a small tent to the front of that camper, sort of like a living room space on the old camper. And we would rent a space at a campground in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And for 5 or 6 days or so, we would live there. There was a pool there. The ocean was there, public bathrooms, all that kind of stuff. And most of our meals would be made from a grill. And it wasn't a gas grill. It wasn't a fancy pants gas grill. It didn't even belong to us. It belonged to the campground. And it was a charcoal grill. When we were younger, you see, my brothers and I were at this stage where we were just fascinated by fire. It's a typical developmental stage for boys in particular. It starts when they're about 5 years old and lasts about 70 or 80 years. But if you know anything about charcoal grilling, you know that the fire can only be sustained when those little charcoal briquettes stay together. Otherwise, that fire goes out. But those little briquettes, it's something about the way that they're constructed that means when they're in community, when they're together, they're on fire. When they're all lumped together, they're able to retain energy and heat. They glow in a way that they could never do if they were on their own, if they were in isolation. Well, that's us. That's the human condition. It's in our DNA. For humans, there's something about when we work together and serve together and learn together and pray together and grow together and confess together and worship together and love together, we're able to experience God in a way that we never can if we live in isolation. In fact, how do you put a charcoal fire out? I mean, there are a couple of ways, but one is to just spread the charcoal out. Put the little charcoal briquette and a little charcoal timeout for a while. And what happens is the fire dims. If you take one of the charcoal briquettes out of community, you put it in isolation, it loses the glow. And it's the same for you and me. The way we find our way back to God, the way God grows us up and expands our faith is in community, in relationship. I mean, think about this for your own life for just a second. Can you think of someone that you feel like God used in a relationship with you to make your faith bigger and stronger? Somebody who, when you look back on it, your lives intersected in some way. And as a result of that relationship, God used it to grow your faith. Even if you're new to this whole conversation of church and God, or maybe you're even skeptical of this whole thing, but is there someone in your life that you've got a relationship with that possibly God used to cause you to have interest in faith or re-examine faith or to give God a chance? I think about that for me, and I'm so very grateful for some people down through the years who have, for whatever reason, have cared enough about me to do life with me, to come alongside of me, to encourage me, believe in me, confront me, pray for me, teach me, take the time to invest in me. And I'm so glad that God used those people, some at very crucial times in my life, to pull me into wherever He wanted me to go. Looking back on different relationships down through the years, and even now, because I chose to participate in those relationships, they shaped my faith in my life. They shaped my view of God. They shaped my perspective and my worldview. They shaped my understanding of what it means to be a Christian. In a lot of ways, they're kind of God-ordained relationships, providential, if you will. If there's one thing that God uses to draw us back to Him, it's relationships. They're kind of at the top of the list. So here's the principle for today. God uses people to stoke our faith. God uses relationships to draw us back to Him and to grow us up and transform our lives. Whenever I hear people share their journey of faith, the story of their journey of faith, relationships are always involved. I never hear people share about things like, hey, on my own or in isolation or all by myself, I discovered God, grew in my faith, I grew on my own, I became everything God wanted me to be, and it had nothing to do with anybody else. If you think that's your story, well, you probably don't know your own story, and you're probably fooling yourself. Because generally speaking, when people tell their story, somewhere in there are some key relationships and relational connectedness. There's a community. Because at the end of the day, God uses human relationships to draw us back to Him and grow us up. Now, the opposite is true as well. It's a principle of life that works the other way too. The other thing I could ask you to imagine, and it might be a bit more prickly to do so, but to look back over your life and identify, has there been anyone who's undermined your faith in God? Is there any relationship that kind of took your legs out from under you when it comes to faith? See, it goes both ways because relationships are powerful things and they intersect for good or for bad because the wrong kinds of relationships have the potential to undermine our faith and the right kinds of relationships have the potential to build and grow our faith. The Bible talks about it this way. Proverbs 13:20 says, walk with the wise and become wise, but a companion of fools suffers harm. You understand what's reflected in this verse here. The people that you choose to surround yourself with have the potential to impact you spiritually. If you surround yourself with wise people, then God uses that opportunity to create something good in you. There's a spiritual component to relationships. Or how about this in the Bible? In 1 Corinthians 15, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good morals. All right, so what he's saying here, that negative relationships can influence the wrong kinds of outcomes in you and the wrong kinds of behaviors. Why? Well, because there's a spiritual nature to relationships. This is why if you're a student and your folks are on you so much about who you're running with, well, it's because of this truth in life. And part of why this is so important and why we need to figure this out is because every single day you're around people, all kinds of people who could care less about your faith. They could care less about the things of God. They have the potential to undermine your faith, to erode it. The overwhelming current of our culture seems, at times, to rush the other way away from the things of God. Every single day we live in a culture that is not pushing us toward greater faith in God. It's just the opposite. We're inundated with a plethora of messages and values and headlines, whatever they are that make us think, well, maybe God's not in control. Maybe I can't trust him. Maybe God's not faithful and good. Maybe I can't wake up every day absolutely confident that God is with me no matter what's happening around me. See, the current we find ourselves in tends to pull us away from the things of God. So it's very important to be intentional about all this. And so I want to challenge us to be intentional. Some of us, and I mean this literally, some of us are capping our faith because we're trying to do it on our own. Or maybe it's just you and your spouse, you and your husband or your wife. And gang, that's just not going to cut it. And some of us just continually ignore this whole arena, and it's going to be to our peril. I urge us all to cooperate with this principle in our life, that God uses human relationships to draw us back to him and mature us. In fact, I'd challenge you to take advantage of the things that this church, that CCC offers and the way we're structured. But you got to get intentional about it. It takes effort, takes hard work to form meaningful relationships, takes a lot of time. It was even hard before there was a pandemic. I mean, before anyone really knew what Zoom was, and the only people who wore masks were surgeons and dentists, and nobody wanted to go to them, But this time we find ourselves in, it's placed an extra challenge in our way to take steps toward forming healthy Christ-centered relationships. But make no mistake, healthy relationships, they take a lot of work, but it's good work, and it's worth the work. I wish it wasn't as hard as it is. I wish you could just call the church up and order 4 or 5 permanent, intimate, life-giving, growth-producing best friends, like carry-out friendships. That'd be great, wouldn't it? But it doesn't work that way. We got to fight for it, and we have to be very intentional about it. And one of my concerns in this last year for our church is that the intensity of the passion you have for God, it just fades. It just fizzles out because we're not connected. And I love that we have this online platform where services can still take place. And we've been striving all this year to provide something you can be proud of, and it's very helpful for you. And I know a whole lot of people who watch online, and they're still connected to their small group or their ministry team, and they continue to be pushed and encouraged and admonished and loved through a small group of friends. But I know a whole lot of folks who've fizzled out, and they've put being relationally connected in a Christ-centered group kind of on the back burner. And if you're acting like the only spiritual dynamic is you and God, well, there are spiritual consequences for that. One thing that hasn't changed is human beings' need for community. That hadn't changed. What has changed and is changing is that people are becoming more and more isolated. In fact, one study in 1985 asked folks in 1985 if they had somebody to talk to about important matters. 10% of people said then in 1985 that they had no one to talk to about important matters. By 2015, it was up to 25% that said, I have no one to talk to about important matters. What do you think 2020, last year into this year, has done to that study? I mean, the bigger pandemic might just be isolation. And for many of us, this is a real issue, a serious struggle. So listen, with as much gentleness as I can say this, and as directly as I can say this, don't be a casualty around this. Get in community. Live in community. Don't be isolated. Don't go it alone. Get intentional about Christ-centered relationships, because God uses human relationships to bring us back to him. So listen, if you're new to CCC, one of the best things you can do is jump into a starter group and start stepping down this path toward greater relational connectedness centered on Christ Jesus. Starter groups happen. They happen all the time. They happen virtually. You can take that step. If you're a student, or if you have a student, if you're the parent of a young life, well, then get your middle schooler or your high schooler or your elementary age kid in our student or children's ministries. Get them in a circle where there are other folks speaking into their lives. I can assure you the day will come when you will wish that they were connected in that environment, around that circle. And the longer you wait, if you wait until you kind of feel like going or they kind of feel like going and invested in this way, well, it'll be too late. I've seen it 100 times over. One of the best things you can do is get them in a place where over time, God can kind of use that group to influence your son or your daughter and connect them to a leader or another person in that group. And something just connects with them and gives them this fresh vision for what faith can look like and what it can actually be in their life. Don't wait until it's too late. And this isn't about some church program. It's about teeing up the potential for relationships that God may use in a wonderful way in your life, because God uses human relationships to draw us back to Him and grow us up in our faith. If you're somebody who's been around CCC for a while, maybe a year or two or a few years, and you regularly do the weekend service, maybe you've even taken part in some events that we've had, but you continue to resist jumping into a group or on a ministry team, and maybe you got your reasons, and believe me, I've heard them all, but I unashamedly challenge you to take a step. Fill out the card in the chat if you're watching this streaming version of this at our services on Sundays, or fill out the card online, or make a call, or send an email, or have a conversation and tell somebody, help me get in a group, help me get on a team. Some of you have filled that out before and you're still not in some group or you're still not connected. Well, fill it out again. Don't let any excuse derail this part of your life. Some of you don't need to fill out anything new. You just need to start going to the group that you know you're already welcomed at. You know somebody who's in a small group. You may even know when they meet, virtually or in person. They may have even invited you to it. You may have even showed up once. But you just need to start showing up regularly and consistently in order to get in the path of this principle. Some of you don't need to be looking for a group. You need to be the one whom God works through, and you need to ask a couple of people that you know, hound the couple of people, and say, hey, we're going to start meeting together on some sort of regular basis to support, encourage, and challenge each other toward greater understanding and devotion to the Lord. You be the one who asks and leads and gets it all rolling. If you're really connected, if you're surrounded by some Christ-centered friends and together you're helping each other, then thank them this week for their role in your life and their impact on your faith. What on earth are we here for? Relational connectedness. It's one of the primary tools God uses to help us find our way back to Him and grow us up into maturity.